We want to go off agenda for just a couple minutes. We have the distinct pleasure of having a Dr. Dennis Kyle from University of Southern Florida out of Tampa here with us today. We didn't know he was going to attend, but we'd like to invite him up for 5 or 10 minutes to talk about some of the work he's doing, and he's gotten a grant from NIH. We'd like to have him talk to us about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for organizing this great symposium, and Sandy for letting me know it was happening and the invitation. As he said, I'm at the University of South Florida in the Department of Global Health and the College of Public Health. I'm one of those science nerds that actually approached this from the parasite side, so I'm trained as a parasitologist. But when I started my training as a grad student over 30 years ago, my project was on Naegleria. In fact, it was supposed to be on a drug discovery project. For several reasons that didn't happen. So I worked on the environmental isolation of this and how physical and chemical factors in the water actually affected the distribution. I think some of the things we found out 30 years ago are sort of not talked about now. We often hear people say, don't stir up the soil, that's how you're gonna get it. We found that the amoeba actually accumulated at different parts in the water. That surface film on the water, we'd actually see more amoeba in the surface film than just inches below that. And then all of us who swim in a warm lake in the summer know that sometimes your feet go down into the cold water. That's actually the thermocline, where the water temperature changes from warm to colder. When that happens, it actually changes the density of the water. And so small particles like sand, amoeba, bacteria will actually change their rate of descent if they're falling through that column and actually accumulate on the thermocline. And one of the things we found by working with a limnologist was that the amoeba actually would accumulate in this thermocline. So you can imagine people swimming, kicking up this thermocline, and all of a sudden you have these amoeba more up in the water column where they could be exposed. So I think, like Francine said, there's so many things we don't know about these, and I think one thing that's been sort of ignored, the original studies in Florida were like the 70s. I don't know of any good studies that looked at why we see more amoeba in some places than others in a long, long time. Excuse me, in a long, long time. So this is one area I think we really need to know about. But as I changed from Naegleria, I worked on other organisms, mostly in drug discovery and mechanisms of resistance and actually developing drugs for other protozoan pathogens. But I kept following amoeba for a long time, and I got frustrated by the fact that we were making all these advances in drug discovery for other pathogens, but nothing really was being pushed forward for these amoeba. So a few years ago, I tried to take the expertise we'd gained and apply that to Naegleria. And what are the problems for discovering a new drug for Naegleria? They're actually quite difficult. First, you have to find a compound that actually kills the organism. All the drugs that we currently use have been found that work on something else. Nothing's ever been discovered or developed specifically for these amoeba. And as you've heard, these amoeba are very unique, and they have different biochemical processes and other things that may lead you to believe, why would we expect antibacterial agents to really work that well? So we really need to find new things that work on these amoeba. Secondly, as we've heard, we really need drugs that work rapidly, because the disease happens so quickly, diagnosis is difficult, and the time from the time you might be able to save somebody to it's too late is very short. So what we're aiming to do right now is try to find new drugs that work very quickly within the first 2 days of treatment. And I can tell you in our lab, when we've approached this, even with the common drugs we use now, most of these take several days, 3, 4, 5 days to work completely. And that's way too long. We need something that works much more rapidly. So what we did was, my team of Dr. Chris Rice and Beatrice Colon, who's a PhD student in my lab, set out to try to discover drugs. And first we had to develop new models. And what we currently use in most drug discovery for these kind of pathogens is what we call phenotypic screening. It's basically you put the parasite with the drug and see if it kills it. And you use a rapid throughput method so you can screen not just hundreds, but literally millions of compounds We didn't have those techniques, so that's what we developed first. We were successful in developing 2 methods that we could use for screening drugs. Then where do you go to find the new drugs? So we have done 2 things, and I'll tell you about the most important one first. That is, we looked at some of the compounds that were known to be active. And one drug that hasn't been talked about today is called pentamidine, which I don't think is a great drug, but it does have activity against free-living amoeba. But it's a very poor drug. It doesn't get to it's toxic, it doesn't get to the right places, but we know it has activity. Well, I've been working with one of the world's experts in the chemistry of this, Dr. Dave Boykin at Georgia State. And what we did was we applied his 30 years of knowledge of these classes with our new techniques, and we've screened through those. And what we've already found in just the first couple of years is that we have compounds which are 500 times more active than anything else we've seen, including the drugs that are out there. So now, what do we do next? Well, that's one approach. But we have to now take this thing that kills the amoeba in a tissue culture dish and actually turn this into something that can be used in people. And that's a very difficult process, which I can go into more detail with anybody who's interested. But we're very fortunate now to be funded by the National Institutes of Health to actually do this. And I won't use the word rare, I use the word neglected. And just to show you how neglected these organisms are, when I started this project trying to convince people to give me money to do this, I did a search on the web, and I looked at the disease I normally work on, malaria. Each month, there are over 350 publications of scientists working on this. And if you look at the number of grants, there are well into $30 million being spent on this, probably. If you look at that for other neglected diseases like roundworms, it's a fraction of that. Naegleria, there were only like 5 grants. One of them was Francine's from a long time ago. And there's been no drug discovery grants, and maybe 10 publications every couple of months. So it just shows you how neglected this is. So what we're doing is trying to open the door and get more people excited about this. We're pursuing our own leads to try to develop those into real drugs, but we're also trying to screen compounds that will open up doors where other chemists say, oh, I've worked on this sort of series, maybe I can also develop something. So that's one of the things that I think some of the work that we're trying to do will help. If anybody wants to know more about that, I'd be glad to talk to you about it anytime, and I'll be here all day. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Kyle. One of the things, I've said it over and over again, this is not rare. To me, it's misdiagnosed, and that's probably the public health message that we need to put out to the greater community. If we don't have the specificity in the test, then we can't say that it is rare.